Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Klitzman. I am the director of the Masters of Bioethics program here at Columbia University, and we're thrilled to welcome you this evening to what should be a fascinating panel on ESG, ethics, social and governance, and bioethics, intersections, opportunities, and challenges, looking at how these different areas and perspectives can mutually benefit from each other, among other things. Clearly, ESG is front and foremost in many of the crises that we as a civilization and as a planet and as a species face. And we're grateful to have a fantastic group of panelists to discuss it with us. First will be Steve Cohen. He is the Senior Vice Dean at the School of Professional Studies. He's a professor of practice in public affairs in the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia. He's been a professor here at Columbia for many years. Also, we're thrilled to have with us Michael Gerard, who is the Andrew Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School and one of our country's leading lawyers on climate change. Paul Washington, who is Director of ESG at the Conference Board, and Tracy Barber, who works with many nonprofits involved in venture capital and ethics. So first to start, Steve, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what you do in the area of ESG.
Well, one of the things I do is I'm the director of the Sustainability Management Program, which is a joint program between the Earth Institute and Climate School and the School of Professional Studies. And part of what we have done in that program, when we started it in 2010, we were really doing what I now call environmental sustainability. In other words, we were adding environmental issues to a management program. A typical management program, like at a business school, teaches you about finance and teaches you about management and strategy, should teach you about ethics. I don't think our business school does much on that, but at least in the sustainability management program, we offer several courses on environmental ethics. But what happened to the field over the last 13 years, it's evolved. And so now we have not just environment, but social impact and governance as part of these, part of the definition of sustainability. So we think about, is this organization attracting the most diverse employees it can? Because we're in a brain-based economy, we want to get the smartest people. And if our organization is racist or sexist or homophobic or xenophobic, we're limiting our talent pool. So DEI becomes a management concept for us. Also, we think in terms of the governance itself, the board of directors of a company or senior management, to make sure that that also has enough diversity that we don't just have, good old boys running the corporation. Finally, we are paying much more attention to issues of environmental justice and the impact of our organization on the surrounding community. The story I've been telling recently has been the comparison of Columbia University when it tried to build its gym in Morningside Park with an entrance at the top for the white college boys and then an entrance at the bottom for the folks from Harlem. That led to a series of demonstrations that closed the university. And the far more sophisticated way, Lee Bollinger figured out a way to site an 18-acre campus in West Harlem by working very closely with the community and hiring, I think, half of Charlie Rangel's staff and enlisting David Dinkins to really understand the politics of Harlem and end up with a $70 million community benefits agreement. And so part of our field has become this understanding of how to engage with communities. And the contrast I also use is, you might have remembered Amazon trying to site headquarters 2 in Long Island City, and the local community went nuts with the idea of us spending $3 billion to attract the richest company in the world to locate in Long Island City, and they didn't get to do it. So the point is that our field is expanding, and the definition of sustainability itself has grown to include these other factors. And now in our curriculum, we have courses on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and social impact, and the role of women. And there are a tremendous number of changes that have happened largely because our students and faculty have insisted on it. So is sort of where my world intersects with yours, Bob.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve. And Paul, what would you say?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And let me give you a little bit of background about where I work and what we do in ESG. I lead the ESG Center, so that should be self-evident, but it's not. So I work at the Conference Board, which is the leading nonpartisan, nonprofit, independent think tank in the world serving the business community. We're headquartered here in New York. We were founded in 1916 at a time of labor management strife, when a lot of corporate leaders thought we ought to be able to do better than have bloody battles on the street between management and unions, basically. And so we have, for over 108 years, helped corporations become better run corporations and more responsible corporate citizens. And I lead within that overall think tank of the Conference Board. I lead the center that focuses on corporate governance, sustainability, as Steve mentioned, writ large. It's not just environmental sustainability. It's everything you do that's in the long-term interests of the corporation, its stakeholders, society at large, and the natural environment. So that's sustainability and corporate philanthropy. So three interrelated areas. And the way we approach it, because we're a think tank, we put out about 50 publications a year. We hold about, 30 to 40 Chatham House rule convenings, confidential discussions with investors, with our corporate members and others to talk about issues that are of importance to them. And then we put out white papers on that, and we participate in lots of programs like this. So our job, unlike almost everyone else in the ESG space, is not to tell companies what to do, not to rank them, not to rate them, not to give them an A or B or an F or whatever. Our job is to help them chart their own course in a financially and ethically responsible manner. So I'm really thrilled to be with you. I love these sorts of programs. I also, along the way, in a 30-year career in corporations, I also taught law school for 10 years. So this is my sort of natural habitat. So I appreciate your opening up your ecosystem to me.
Great. Well, we're thrilled to have you. And Tracy Barber, you direct venture and equity ethics. Do you want to tell us a bit about what that is and what you do?
Sure. I am the executive director at Santa Clara University's Margolis Center for Applied Ethics, and I lead the Venture Equity and Ethics Institute. So it's the sort of first institute that's focused on applied ethics and venture capital. And my role in ESG is I have been at the sort of forefront of implementing ESG considerations into early stage startups and within the venture capital community, working with funds mainly.
That's great. And Michael, do you want to tell us what you do?
Yeah, sure. So before going into academia, I practiced environmental law for 30 years in New York City with a couple of law firms, advising many companies and other entities on the E part of ESG, although we didn't call it ESG at the time. I joined the Columbia faculty in 2009 as a professor in the law school, where I teach courses on environmental law, energy regulation, and climate change law. And I founded and direct the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law, which now has 15 lawyers working full-time on various issues in climate change law. We are, among many other things, following very closely the emerging legal requirements for climate and other disclosures from the SEC and the state of California and Europe and other places. So the development of ESG, especially the environmental part, is something we're looking at very closely.
Great. Well, thank you. And before I go to the next question, I just want to again welcome all our attendees and just emphasize we see this as a very interactive session. So please feel free to put any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we're going to hear a bit more from our panelists and then open up for Q&A. So please think of questions, and please don't be shy in putting questions there. So what are the biggest ethical challenges you see facing ESG today? Steve, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I think, let's just talk about New York City for a moment. We have a new law which requires large buildings to decarbonize and to become more energy efficient. We also have 90,000 homeless people in New York City at the same time. And so one of the ethical issues we're going to face as we gradually become a more sustainable city is to make sure that the impact of of decarbonization and renewable energy doesn't price even more poor people out of the housing market. And so there are, in fact, trade-offs between our very important environmental goals and these also equally important goals of making sure children have a roof over their head. And so these trade-offs are real and require us to be thinking very carefully about how fast we move and what the costs of that movement are. And I think in general, with environmental issues, we have been doing, since the creation of EPA in 1970, a really good job of gradually cleaning up most of our air and water, although as Mike Gerard will tell you, not all of it and not fast enough, but we're still better than we were. But it's been a gradual process because we need to make sure that other things that are important to us are maintained.
Great. Paul, thoughts, biggest ethical challenges you see?
Yeah, I think this entire area is essentially one big ethical challenge, because the traditional view of a corporation, well, at least the view from the 1980s on, was that a company existed primarily to serve the interests of its investors, its shareholders. So it served capital markets. That was pretty simplistic. Now, it's never been that simple, and it certainly wasn't that simple before, and in practice, it's never been that simple. But if you're thinking about the elements of a sustainable corporation today, it's one that serves the corporation, that serves its stockholders and other stakeholders, that serves society at large, and that serves the long-term welfare of the natural environment. So those are multiple folks to whom you have an ethical obligation. And so the core challenge is, what are your obligations to each of those constituencies? How do you balance the interests of all of those constituencies? And how do you measure whether you're actually doing a decent job of it? And corporations are not necessarily all that well equipped to do this. You've got a board of directors, and under law, the company is managed by or at the direction of the board. The board is generally much better informed about the interests of the shareholders. You've got a lot of metrics that help you determine whether you're serving shareholders, your total shareholder return and so forth. So they're very well equipped to do that. They're not as well equipped culturally or in terms of information to see, well, are we actually serving the interests of employees, of our communities? Are we actually, how are we doing in terms of the environment? It's a much bigger challenge, to have the information, to have the skills to do that, to have the processes to make those decisions. And then frankly, it's up to every single board under law and market forces to determine where it wants to be on the ethical scale. Do you want to be Gordon Gekko? Sorry for the dated reference, and greed is good. Or do you want to be a tree hugger, right? Like, you get to decide where you want to be on that spectrum in the context of your business strategy and the law and market forces. So all of this, to my mind, these fundamental questions of how you balance these interests, how you measure them, how you measure your own performance is just, it's almost synonymous with an ethical challenge.
Well said. Tracy, thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that similarly for especially in early stage innovation or early stage companies, which is where I spent a lot of time focusing, these same issues kind of come up around, at the early stages, it's about getting more customers or getting more data, which, comes with it, privacy concerns and this constant sort of tug of war between what is, profit motive, scaling, getting more traction, and just proving the innovation. And when do you start to sort of integrate these kinds of ethical guidelines in your thinking? And it always seems to be something that you can kick down the road quite a bit. But as some of, I think your other guests will speak to, and on the corporate side, it doesn't become any easier as your companies get larger and as they scale. So I do see a lot of these kinds of questions, in particular around data privacy and innovation.
Do you want to be specific? Any examples come to mind about that? Companies kicking things down the road, maybe where they shouldn't have?
Well, I don't know if I'm not in a position to say that I was on the inside when they were making these decisions,
Sure,
but
right.
it certainly looks like, there are a number of instances. I think one of the more recent ones, is 23andMe. One could look at that and say, okay, it very Silicon Valley style to want to go out and get as much, data and input as you can, and then start to build the model and worry more and more about security and data protection as you go along. And it could very well be that you just don't know what you don't know, especially in the early stage of a company's development and a product development. So that's an example, a more recent example around some of the healthcare stuff, especially as it relates to as I said, early stage innovation. In particular, this conversation is going to become more and more important as we start talking about AI.
Great. Michael, thoughts?
So I want to say a few words about supply chains. Many, if not most, of the environmental impacts of a company are not from what it directly does, but from the suppliers that provide it with the materials and services that it uses to make what it does, and then the customers who buy what it makes. In the disclosure realm, we talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions are the emissions directly from the company, from its factories, its vehicle fleets, and so forth. Scope 2 emissions are mostly from making the electricity that it buys. And scope 3 is the supply chain, both upstream and downstream. A lot of companies report their scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions aren't so hard to get, but few companies report scope 3, or at least a broad range of scope 3. In May of 2022, the Securities and Exchange Commission proposed an elaborate set of regulations on climate disclosure that included disclosure of scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. That's been met with massive opposition from the business community and lots of threats of lawsuits. The SEC hasn't come down with its final rule. It may come down in the next few weeks, but the general sense is they're probably going to drop the scope 3 requirement. But meanwhile, the state of California has adopted a new law that requires scope 3 disclosures. It's been signed by Governor Newsom. It is now law, and it applies to any company that does business in California, which is about 75% of all the big companies around. Europe is requiring similar requirements. So there's a lot of pushback against disclosure of scope 3 emissions, but by avoiding disclosure of scope 3 emissions, a company can externalize and conceal its true environmental impact. It is reporting the emissions that it's legally responsible for, but I would argue not those that it is ethically responsible for. Because it's intentionally causing them to happen. The same concept applies to impacts other than climate change. For instance, the impact of supply chains on biodiversity. And since I understand there are a number of physicians in the audience, I'm going to talk for a minute about pharmaceuticals. The manufacture of many drugs has significant impacts on biodiversity and on animal welfare. Some chemotherapy drugs, for instance, require taking down endangered trees and other plants. Much hormone replacement therapy. The drugs are made for some of the drugs, they're made from the urine of pregnant horses. And there are estimates that are about 700 farms with 80,000 horses that are kept constantly pregnant and under what some have called inhumane conditions. But very few doctors and even fewer patients know about this. Those who care about animal welfare might regard this as unethical and at a minimum would want to know about it. There are many other examples, but the nature of the supply chains for many pharmaceuticals, as well as many other products, is rarely disclosed. Animal testing is another example where there are a lot of inhumane practices that lead to important therapies and important drugs. So how broadly do companies define the environmental and social impacts that they care about and that they want to disclose? There are lots of impacts of the supply chain that are rarely disclosed, but so I see an ethical problem if a company is purporting to be environmentally and socially positive when it's actually externalizing a lot of its environmental and social impacts and refusing to disclose them.
Can I pick up on something there, Bob? Because I think it's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
important. What Michael said is it's really important for anyone who's following the law in this area. So the old-fashioned approach was you had to look at the effects, well, old-fashioned, still current US law, right? It's the effects of the environment and social issues and so forth on your company. You had to disclose anything that was material to your company's financial performance. That's called single materiality. What Europe is embracing with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and people say, Europe, whatever, that's directly affecting 3,000 US companies who are now going to have to disclose under European regulation. They embrace the notion of double materiality. So you have to disclose whether something is material to your company or it's disjunctive or material to the external world, and there are 10 different ESG categories, and it's up and down your entire supply chain. So it's a very broad definition of materiality, and it captures what Michael's talking about here, which is our ethical obligation here is not just, and our legal obligation here is not just to think about what climate can do to us, and therefore as a company, and therefore to our shareholders, but what we and our entire value chain, and there's a question of how much privity of contract you have and so forth, but in your entire value chain can do to the environment, can do to society, can do to things like compliance with the law and things like that. So it's a much more expansive view of the legal obligation to disclose, and that perhaps inspires people to have a sense of a moral obligation or ethical obligation that goes along with it as well. Just one thing to note, Europe is also working on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which, if the CSRD is about disclosure to the world, this is about compliance. And you will actually have a legal obligation to mitigate all of those negative impacts up and down your value chain, and eliminate those that happen. Either eliminate the negative effects you're having now, or reduce the risk of it happening in the future. It is, if that's adopted, that is a profound legal shift in the regime for this world, and in fact, for many US companies. So I just wanted to flag that. What Michael was talking about is actually a profound shift in the way that companies are actually being required to think about their legal obligations, their disclosure obligations, and therefore their ethical obligations. Hope that's okay with you, Michael, but I just want to jump in.
I agree with that. And let me add a couple of things, if I may. In first place, the California law is just about climate, but it has no materiality requirement. So companies are going to have to report their Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, regardless of whether the material, unlike the SEC rule. Right. California law also applies not only to public companies, which are subject to the SEC, but also to private companies. The European rules, as Paul said, have double materiality, and part of the double is not only climate, but also biodiversity, and social impacts and community impacts. So it's a lot broader than just climate.
Yeah, it's 10 separate ESG areas. And
so let me make a point about all this, because the lawyers are very good at setting up the framework and the rules, but I actually have students that work in these organizations and have to figure this stuff out. And in fact, on Monday night, we're doing a panel discussion in Low, which won't be on, we'll record it. It's on life cycle analysis and life cycle assessment. We're actually trying, one of our most popular classes in the sustainability management program is trying to figure out, how do you look at an organization and its entire production and consumption and waste cycle, and how do you estimate the full impact of what this organization is doing on everything it does? And Christoph Meinrecken, who is a really brilliant guy who's developing this methodology, actually has a patent on how to estimate greenhouse gas emissions from scope 1, 2, and 3. I mean, one of the difficult problems that organizations have, and this is perhaps not an ethical issue, it's just a practical issue, is how do you get the information from your supply chain? Even if they are interested in telling you, how do you get it? How do you audit it? How do you make sure it's accurate? So we're at the very beginning, I think, of a revolution in how organizations are going to act in relation to their overall environment. And our graduates, our students are heavily involved in trying to figure this stuff out. And I think one of the roles of students coming out of your program will also be to focus not just on these technical and analytic issues of how much and what's its impact, but also what does this mean for people? Some of the things that Mike Gerard was talking about, the biodiversity issues, the animal, the issues on impacts on animals, but also how do we look at an organization as it relates to its social and economic environment and its community, and what it does there. I mean, one of the things that's part of a real life cycle analysis is to look at child labor, and it is what is your supply chain low cost because you've got kids that should be at school instead, making clothing. So all of these issues are getting tied together. And the one piece of good news I'll give you is our graduates won't work for organizations that don't take this seriously. And they're transforming these organizations from within. And it's one of the most thrilling things that I think we're going to see over the next decade. We'll be long gone, but they're going to be pushing pretty hard to make this stuff happen.
Yeah, I think just picking up on that, if I could, every company is competing at least three markets. It's markets for products and services, right? And thus far, we're seeing businesses be more interested in buying sustainable products than consumers, generally speaking. It's not universal, but businesses are ahead. They're competing in capital markets. So investors lean generally in favor of sustainability. But as you point out, Stephen, it's the labor markets that are going to be a very strong driver for companies here in the sustainability transformation. And I would just note that in our view, this is we're in yet another phase of the digital transformation of our global economy with generative AI, right? But we are at the early stages of a sustainability transformation of our economy. And it is going to be as dramatic, as impactful, as important as any digital transformation. And so I think anyone in the field who's interested in getting to, whether in public or private service these days, sector service these days, needs to be conscious of that and needs to be skilled to be able to ride that wave and contribute to that sustainability transformation.
So when you say a transition, what's that going to look like? So in other words, 5 years from now or 10 years, or what are we going to see that we don't see today?
Well, one of the things you're going to see is a much higher use of renewable energy in organizations, much greater concern on what happens to the waste from organizations. We're already starting to see some of that now. It's getting pushed, particularly at the local level. I mean, in New York City and in places like California, there are in fact regulations and very strong movements toward some of these toward the development of a renewable resource-based economy. It's a little bit of 2 steps forward and 1 step back because, as Mike was saying, some companies are resisting it. I mean, you look at Norfolk Southern that practically destroyed East Palestine with their toxics. So they're in Ohio spending over $1 billion to clean up the mess they made. And they were in Washington fighting the common sense regulation on freight trains and their safety. So we do see a tug and pull. But I think, and I'm actually pretty confident that people are not stupid and they don't like to get poisoned. It's just one of those things that the average person is not that crazy about.
So hopefully greater use of renewable energy, less impact on biodiversity, because once the species are gone, they're just gone. I mean, there's stuff you can do about planting more trees to take carbon out, but when species are gone, they're gone. I think lower waste. On the social side, hopefully you'll see more responsible employment practices, not just as the supply chain, but at your own company, or your own organization. Because when we've done our surveys of 2,000 or 3,000 actually U.S. consumers, the #1 sustainability issue they care about, above climate, above all else, are fair wages and fair labor conditions, regardless of a person's background. So the E issues, the fundamental economic issues of economic fairness, cut across the red-blue divide in this country. And those hopefully, I mean, whether it's through unionization or not needing even unionization or whatever, I think that a more sustainable, corporate set of corporate practices is going to embrace things along the way of a living wage, whether it's mandated or not.
Tracy, you want to jump in? Any thoughts on these issues?
I think, it's interesting. I was in the early days of sort of the clean tech movement in Silicon Valley anyway, and funding companies like Tesla and others. And I heard a lot of these same predictions. So I'm just gonna reserve my thoughts on whether I hope that it does. Let's put it that way. I certainly think that the sort of those that are in the companies now really have an opportunity to continue to push forward, and yeah.
But can I pick up on that? Because there's a major disconnect out there between the opportunities and what's actually happening. We actually did see in the S&P 500 the smallest increase in greenhouse gas emissions in a long time. It's actually there is progress being made on this front, so that's good. But according to a recent survey we did of 1,600 C-suite executives around the world, around 600 CEOs, over half of the CEOs around the world said renewable energy is going to be good for their company. It was one of the lowest areas of focus for investment in 2024. They see it, okay, but it's a low priority. One of the reasons is it's capital intensive. There's a whole lot that goes with this, right? So we know we need to do it. It's going to be good for us, but not just yet. The other big challenge is that the transition to renewable energy, there are some companies that are looking at this as energy autarky, right? Like, I've just built my own, I'll get off the grid. I'll have my own mini nuclear power plant, right? Like they'll do that, right? So there are people who are thinking about that, but generally speaking, companies are going to have to collaborate with each other in government to make this transition. But companies are inherently competitive creatures. And this goes to an ethical question, right? Like, they're not collaborative creatures. And so both the opportunities that exist in AI and other areas and renewable energy, and the risks that occur if we don't grapple with these issues, are ones that are too big for any company to deal with. And so you have a fundamental governance issue, a fundamental question of incentives and so forth, of like, you need to collaborate. You need to partner with others, both horizontally within your own industry and vertically in your supply chains, to address these issues. It's not necessarily something that companies are naturally attuned to, and especially some of your early startups who are run by some of my favorite megalomaniacs in the world, who think they're going to solve it all by themselves, right? So it's a challenge when you've got to actually do things collaboratively.
And a related challenge, a related challenge to collaboration is the antitrust laws.
Yes,
and some of those who don't like the ESG collaboration are challenging it under the antitrust laws. So we have a legal obstacle, at least a purported one, that's standing in the way to a certain extent.
So how do we overcome this? Because the competitiveness and people feeling, well, I just want to go ahead and pollute and whatever it is not doing us any favors. And as you say, people know we need to get to renewable energy, and do more, but certainly the US, we're not quite there yet. EU is ahead of us. How do we get more traction, buy-in? Does it have to come from enlightened leaders on top? Or I think in the EU, it's both, the populace saying this is important and leaders following that? Or what's your take on all that? Any thoughts?
I think it's a combination of things, Bob. First, you have to have the legal structure because it creates a kind of floor under requirements, but you also have to have the investment in the technology. I mean, one of the problems with renewable energy right now is that the technology is not exactly where it needs to be. But I think it's getting there. You know, I'm always making the point in class. When I was in graduate school, I worked on a computer that was the size of my living room and had 1/100th of the computing power of this thing. And how did that happen? The Defense Department worked on it, the federal, other companies worked on it, and there was lots of technological innovation. There's Moore's Law, which talks about how computing power just kept exponentially increasing. Now, if you think about it, look at what's happened with how you watch movies at home. You used to watch Saturday night at the movies. You had to watch them on Saturday night, and there were commercials. Then you went and got a video cassette from Blockbuster. Then Netflix sent you a disc, and now it all streams. And so all of the packaging and material has been transformed. The average kid in my class, I shouldn't call it a kid, the young adults in my classes don't have cable television, don't have landlines, are not connected even wirelessly to the internet. They get their wireless through a variety of sources. And so you see the technology of communication advancing. So what's going to happen when you can put a solar array in your window in your apartment building and the battery is the size of your laptop and the whole thing costs you $300? We won't need a grid for people's homes. And if you think that's not going to happen, you should see the development all over the world on battery technology and solar energy. So you need that. But what's most important, I think, and we're seeing this, is the cultural shift, which is to say that young people, particularly highly educated young people that are running these organizations that are coming into it, and of course we see a biased sample at Columbia, so I recognize it's not everybody, but there are lots and lots of people paying attention to something they didn't pay attention to. And in organizations, this is now considered part of good management. In other words, if you pollute and you waste energy and you risk environmental liability like the Norfolk Southern had, that's just bad management. The whole Cancer Alley in Louisiana, all these chemical plants spewing stuff out into, why can't they figure out a way to make chemicals without, spewing everything out into the water, into the air? I mean, there are ways of doing it. And we're starting to see, the last thing I want to say is, the technology, for example, of agriculture. You look at a company like Land O'Lakes, and they're using satellites, they're using robotics, they're using artificial intelligence so that they specifically tailor how much water, pesticide, and herbicide and fertilizer go onto a plant so none of it ends up in the groundwater. So that's the future, the combination of technology, legal requirements, and cultural change, and it's all happening right now.
But I'd say two things that are going to spur it. One is the ROI, the risk of inaction, and the ROI, you got to make money at this, right? And that's the positive return on investment. And I think part of what's driving this whole area, it used to be big investors, but they've actually become quieter. They still care about it, but you read their statements, they are pushing a lot less now for a variety of reasons. But you're seeing regulators step up. So especially in Europe. So European, by the way, Europe does not lead the world in innovation in this area. Europe leads the world in regulation in this area, and there is a difference, right? So, you talk to people investing, and you say, "Are you overweighting European funds for social impact or American funds?" They're not actually. They see a lot of opportunity with U.S. companies. So, but European regulation. So there's going to be risk of inaction if you don't act. You're going to be dragged there through regulation. You're going to lose when 70% of procurement executives are looking at the sustainability of your record in greenhouse gas emissions, your DEI, or your diversity, equity, inclusion record. They're not going to do business with you unless you've got a decent record. Okay, so that's going to drag you. But what's really going to happen is when companies see this as a place where they can make money, where there's opportunity, not just cost savings because you're using less energy or something, but where there are real opportunities to make money like there were in the digital transformation. And I think that's it. And companies, that requires a very profound mindset shift for a lot of folks, because so much of the focus on let's take environmental risk was, okay, climate change is terrible for everyone. I'm a big institutional investor. I invest in every company in America. I want to reduce the risk of climate change because it helps to lower the risk of my entire portfolio. Well, that only gets you so far. What you actually need is people who are going to be focusing on how you make money
Right.
in this area. And so that's the return on active investment. That's what's ultimately going to drive this. And that requires something that we're working with companies on, which is to build sustainability knowledge into your corporate culture, just like integrity, just like digital capabilities. Build sustainability knowledge and culture and mindset and capabilities into your corporate culture, and turn all your employees basically into innovation engines that are going to come up with really good ideas. And then, frankly, what companies need, which they've never had actually, is an enterprise opportunity management system, the way they have an enterprise risk management system that captures those good ideas in the sustainability space and brings them to fruition. So there are possibilities here, but it requires a degree of agility and some new processes in place that companies don't actually have right now.
So leads my next question. So young people, we have a number of young people joining us this evening as attendees. If they're interested in getting involved in these issues or in these spaces and their jobs and corporations, what should they do? What kinds of jobs should they look for? What kind of skills should they be getting in graduate school at Columbia or elsewhere, or things they should be looking, or places? Any suggestions?
Tracy, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, there's a couple of things I would say about that. One is a lot of this is really you're carving out new, as many of the panelists have already discussed. There's still a lot to be learned, to be done. There are trade-offs. So it's not a straight path. There's not a sort of, a cookie cutter process, and all you have to do is go in and sort of scale it. It's unique to every context and product and supply chain. So beyond the science or specifics of, business that you're learning, I think, the interdisciplinary approach of understanding that you're going to come across a number of different stakeholders throughout this process of creating change and implementing new processes, designing new processes, and that sort of thing. And in that instance, you're really, it's not just so much about your sort of technical knowledge, but it's also about your ability to influence others. And so thinking about, in addition to the sciences, thinking about things like communications, even I would say, marketing and branding are also equally important. And I also think the other piece of it is if you have the science but don't have the business, it is important, to earlier points about this ROI is critical. You need to be able to understand not just the cost efficiencies, but also looking at opportunities that could be created for companies as a result of going down this path. And it'll be a little bit like, riding the bicycle and building it at the same time. I think that's the sort of world that I live in on a daily basis. And I see this, being more the norm these days. And I think it will continue to be because, there aren't any straightforward answers.
I think to build on that point, what I would say is, when we built the Earth Institute at Columbia starting in the late 1990s, we realized to solve the problem of sustainable development, environmental sustainability, and now what we're calling sustainability, we needed a lot of different forms of expertise. We needed environmental scientists and ecologists, but we needed lawyers, we needed economists, we needed public health experts, we needed people that understood organizational management and understood politics, and we had to get them to sit down together and collectively problem solve. And so one of the things that we do a lot of in all of our master's programs these days is get students to work on group skills and how to be part of a team and how to be a constructive team player. And, what I would also say that one of the, let's call it technical skills in here is having experience in balancing these ethical issues and in thinking about the trade-offs involved. And also cutting through some of the mythology. I mean, I'm always hearing, about how regulations put companies out of business when in fact the opposite is what happens, but also that most change, including regulatory change, takes a long time. So, I always think about the Resource Conservation Recovery Act we passed in 1976, and the final regs didn't come out until, what was it, 1993, Mike? That was, and then the companies were given a 10-year compliance schedule. to, when you finally got down to enforcement. But at the end of the 20 years, you saw real significant change in how things work. And so I think that one of the things I would say to students is that, there are a lot of different elements of the ESG world that require you to develop your own expertise. In the case of say, Bob, your program, some of these issues related to ethics and bioethics are part of it, but also learn how to deal with the complexity and translate and understand what other people are saying to you, and learn how to be part of a team that focuses on getting the goals of the team and getting the problem addressed. And I think that that's really, really important because these problems are complicated. The different disciplines that are needed and the different forms of expertise that are needed. The last story I'll tell is, when I was in EPA, we just sold Congress on giving us $2 billion to clean up toxic waste sites. So I go to a meeting with some soil scientists and environmental engineers, and they say, "Oh, we don't know how to clean up a waste site. We have no idea. We've never done it before." And so, we actually had to learn how to contain waste, and we actually focused most of the first 2 years of the program on emergency response actions to get people out of harm's way, because we didn't even understand, the people working on this didn't understand how complicated detoxifying land was. And so the point is, these problems have lots and lots of different dimensions, and there's lots of roles for professionals across the board who are interested in solving them.
Yeah, and Bob, because I wholeheartedly agree with what was said, and I'll just put some sort of very practical numbers around it, because we're in the field right now conducting a survey of chief sustainability officers, which is now a more common position at U.S. companies. About 20% of U.S. companies have one directly reporting to the CEO. About 40% of European companies have one. So it's a common position. Do you know how large those sustainability departments are at most U.S. companies? 4 people. So it's small, right? So if you're just trying to become a sustainability person, good luck, right? But almost every single one of these companies has a steering committee that's got people from the business units, that's got communications people, that's got marketing people, that's got finance people, that's got tech people, that's got R&D people. And all those people are involved in solving those complicated issues and developing, executing the company's strategy internally. So there are a lot of opportunities that exist. And I think, and I could not agree more, the communications, the influencing skills, the basic knowledge of business is so important. Some of the best sustainability leaders are those who come and have been running a business unit, right? Because they understand how to get stuff done and so forth. And the soft skills are awfully important. But I do think that it's better if you come out with a focus on sustainability and finance and law and marketing and some other area, operations, whatever it might be, because it's like consumers don't necessarily buy a product because it's sustainable, they buy it because it's sustainable and it's attractive or it's lower priced. So just like there's a market for goods out there that are sustainable, there's a market for employees out there, and it's a great advantage, but it really helps if you can couple it with another skill set.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add is one, the future is so unpredictable that career paths are also unpredictable. It's no longer the case that you can say, it used to be that you graduate from law school, you join a big firm, in 8 years you become a partner, you spend the rest of your career there. That's no longer the case in law, and it's even less the case in so many other fields. So having flexibility and not trying to lock yourself into something. I also think it's very important to identify what kind of activities you like. Some people like to crunch numbers. Some people like to write. Some people like to talk. Some people like to manage other people. There are lots of other kinds of skills that people can use, and people should find the things that they're most comfortable doing, because there are going to be many opportunities to use those particular, not only skills, but personality traits.
Yeah.
So here's a question that came in. I'm just going to bring us back a little bit. So to bring this back to environmental and medical ethics, while 100,000 tons of pharmaceutical products are consumed globally every year as human and veterinary drugs, a significant amount of APIs are actually released to the environment, since 30 to 90% of an oral dose is excreted in urine as an active substance. A significant consequence of PIs is the acceleration of antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. It is projected that by 2050, AMR could become the #1 cause of death at 10 million people each year, even compared to cancer at 8.2 million deaths per year. From an ethical standpoint, how are physicians supposed to balance a duty to care to patients today versus antimicrobial resistance and health risk to populations in the future? Great discussion, everyone. So none of you are physicians, so you don't have to focus on that. But just to come back to how these ethical choices are made of, benefits today, let's just take the drug, versus long-term risks. I mean, who at a concrete level, who's making those? Are they being made well, those kinds of ethical decisions? Could they be made better? If so, how? Any thoughts?
Well, one of the things I was going to say about the problem is, we just had a presentation by one of the people at Lamont who's studying the microplastics that are in our water, and he basically said that bottled water had a lot more of this in it than tap water. And so one of the questions is, are there technologies that can be developed to address those issues? And in the case of the urine that was just described, can we figure out ways of filtering it out of the water supply through sewage treatment? And there's been, in the history of sewage treatment, you had what was originally called primary treatment, which was screens to keep out the big stuff. You had secondary treatment where you advanced through additional technologies to prevent pollution. And now you have tertiary, where you actually chemically transform the waste stream so that it is actually clean when you are relatively clean when you send the sewage back into the water. So one of the issues here is, can we allocate resources to develop technology to deal with these newly discovered problems? And in terms of the ethical issues for doctors, Bob, we're going to have to ask you to answer that question, because that's well outside of our area of expertise.
Well, I'll tell you what happens there is that this often comes up, whereas for many infections, there's the generic penicillin, or sort of early generation antibiotic, and then there are fancier third, fourth generation antibiotics that drug companies push. Drug companies make more money on them because they're not generic, and patients often want them. They want the fancy drug, a little more powerful, and so there's this push for sort of the technological new thing, or a lot of times actually for people have a cold, a flu, and the doctor, they want something done. And we know that it's probably viral, not bacterial. So an antibiotic probably won't do anything, but people are happy to get the zip pack or whatever it is. It's going to, give them an antibiotic that can be doing something in case it's bacterial, even though overwhelmingly it's not viral, and it's going to get better on its own in a few days. And the antibiotic's not going to do much, and it will create more antibiotic resistance, in fact. So a lot is sort of pressures from patients, drug companies fueling this a bit, doctors trying to make the patient happy. Here's something to make you feel better, rather than when you come in and you're sick and you feel like crap, the doctor says, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can give you. Yeah, well, why don't you try this antibiotic in case it's bacterial? So I think, and there have been efforts to educate physicians, but I think there's no financial incentive for physicians to hold back on the fancy antibiotics that will then have less effectiveness over time as the newest antibiotic, because there'll be resistance. So I would say that is sort of parallel to some of the phenomena you're facing, I think.
It's the tragedy of the commons in some ways, right? Like that's sort of what we face here. And in some ways, the only way you can do that, you can deal with these sorts of things, is actually through some form of regulation. But perhaps the regulatory regime here, to Stephen's point, is not so much a game of gotcha or thou shalt not. Maybe it's a little bit more of, okay, what can we do to change the incentives here that change behavior? What can we do in terms of technology or something? Because I think, like, even in the cybersecurity realm, the whole regulatory regime we live under is gotcha. Oh, the data was breached. Okay, you're a bad company, you know, all this sort of stuff. It's naturally not one of partnership to try to avoid it. So I do think in some of these cases, private ordering is not going to be enough to achieve, where each company or each doctor on their own makes a different ethical choice. And you're going to need some form of regulation. Having said that, we've got a paper that we're going to be producing on the state of sustainability in the healthcare provider sector in the United States. And two things leap out from that. I'll give you a little preview. The first is the healthcare sector in the United States has, in the provider side, has essentially some of the worst governance in America. Only 18% of the directors, and these are the public companies, have experience in corporate governance. And so much of what we're talking about making these choices here is a question of governance, right? It's because, you know, how you balance these interests. So there's a weakness there. The other thing is there's a weakness inherent in the strength in the medical field and the healthcare provider sector. They're so good at serving patients and saving lives that has that's their purpose. And that purpose has sometimes come to the exclusion of viewing the broader purpose of, oh my gosh, what we're doing for the environment is actually harming all of those communities that we're trying to help. And so but it's really hard to broaden the aperture of people who have been very successful at narrowly focusing on serving a constituency or a purpose, to sort of say, wait a second, you got to broaden your aperture and think about the environmental impacts as well. It's sometimes harder to get people who are really good on the S to focus on the E, even when every E issue is also an S issue when you think about it. So anyway, just it's some of the challenges here. Government's going to play a role. Better governance in the healthcare system will play a role. But I think just redefining sustainability and thinking about it, you know, more broadly within the healthcare sector will help.
Let me just say that the very interesting question that was posed about antimicrobial resistance is something that's very much at the intersection of technology and regulation, and at two levels. The technology of drug development. Is it possible to develop drugs that do what you want, that don't have that effect? And if so, should the FDA or develop regulations to require the use of that? And then technologies, as Steve mentioned, to have wastewater treatment that takes the stuff out so that it doesn't get there. And if that technology exists, then certainly the Clean Water Act is well equipped to require it. But I'm not aware that there's a huge push to do that, to develop wastewater treatment standards that would require that. I think that's one thing that the pollution control industry hasn't much woken up to.
So how about pushback against ESG? One reads about this, that there's backlash. How bad is it? Why is it there? Will it have much of an effect? What should be done?
Yeah, this is the woke management stuff. Yeah. And, you know, I wrote a blog piece about how people who, some of these folks that aren't paying attention to are asleep. So I think I'd rather be awake than asleep. But the point is that it has become politicized because certain politicians who don't really understand organizational management, you know, figure this is a way to make a little political hay. And that's just going to keep happening. I mean, I don't see that stopping. And I do think that some companies that were in it just for the PR value are saying, wait a minute, just in for the PR value, maybe the PR value isn't that good. And so they're quote unquote pulling back. But the companies that are serious about this, that have integrated it into their organizational management, they're not going to walk away from it because it's basically part of their method of making money. I mean, Walmart is always, in my classes, the example I like to use. They're the fastest adopters of solar power in America because they happen to have all these flat roofs and they use a lot of energy in their store. They have plenty of capital, so they're able to take this technology. The other thing they do, talk about supply chains, their suppliers are required to fill out audits about how sustainable the products are that they're trying to sell at Walmart. And the third thing Walmart's doing is the companies that are can demonstrate that they are adhering to sustainability principles get paid faster. They've actually made a deal with one of their banks to pay the suppliers faster. They're paying attention. So those companies, a company like that, they're not going to be frightened by, the governor of Texas or the governor of Florida, politicizing these things. But then there are people who will be paying attention to it. And, that's just the way this works. 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, so we've done a report on this on ESG backlash, and about 40% of US companies have experienced it. It's generally mild thus far, but 61% say that it's going to get worse. And it's going to be coming from more sources. So thus far, it's largely come from state policymakers. And there's a real concern that it will spread more to federal officials, even to local officials who will make hay on it. Some investors are concerned it'll spread to employees and customers who are reading in the press like, oh, ESG is like evil, right? And so, but keeping in mind, so it's there and it's going to grow. I would note that backlash is in fact an umbrella term that embraces healthy skepticism, because there's backlash from very sophisticated people who say, you know what, those ESG funds are overcharging fees, right? Like there's people are selling us a little air. So there's some healthy skepticism, there's some legitimate philosophical opposition, and then there's also political opportunism. So you get a spectrum of things under the heading of ESG backlash. It's going to be there. It's going to be there for a while. In some ways, it says that this is actually important enough to have opposition to it. And I think our recommendation to companies is to use this as an opportunity not to circle the wagons and sort of say, we don't want to listen to any of you people who are objecting, but to actually sharpen your thinking about it, figure out, okay, did we go overboard on something? Is it, how does this really fit in with our business strategy? Were we a roving commission on social issues? Right? Or were we actually focusing on the issues where we have credibility to speak and make a difference and we'll follow through, right? Like, let's sharpen our thinking and let's sharpen our communication. So I actually think at the end of the day, the backlash, it is currently making life hell for a lot of companies who are having to comply with regulations in one state that to put them in odd with regulations in another state. So there is a lot of bad that's happening because of this. But overall, if it causes people to sort of think and be more authentic and be more strategic about it, it could actually be not the worst thing that's happened in this field, because if you're just living in an echo chamber that's all pro ESG all the time, you're not necessarily going to be investing as wisely as if you have to justify your opposition, your position to maybe sometimes a skeptical audience. I think the opportunism is a problem, but the skepticism is actually a fairly healthy aspect of this.
Well, I tend to think that the backlash has much more bad than good associated with it. I think it really is having impacts. I think it's why the SEC is backing off on the Scope 3 requirements. It's why you have some states that are saying you can't think about climate change, you can't think about these other things. I think it's why a lot of companies are retreating from the ESG funds, and a lot of the opposition is coming from corporations that may not want to wave the flag, but there are really some dark money interests, some others. There are some groups that are promoting this, and I think it's having negative impacts. It is becoming part of the terrible partisanship we have in our country, and I think that it is highlighting the importance of politics, old-fashioned politics, in where we go. When young people ask me, what can I do right now that will have the greatest effect on climate change? What I tell them we could do right now is engage in voter registration in a swing state. Because what makes more difference than anything else is who's in the White House and who's in Congress. And that's really important, and the importance of it can't be overstated.
Mike, I agree with you, but I also think the political environment does condition a lot of what goes on. But I also think that the organizations themselves that are serious about this have started to think about this as part of the definition of effective management.
Yeah,
and I think when that happens, they're pretty impervious to the political side of it. I think frankly, the danger in the political side is more on the infrastructure that we need in order to get to sustainability. And so, and I particularly think about, some of the things that are in the Inflation Reduction Act and in the infrastructure bill that, like installing heat pumps in public housing, or, modernizing the grid, or investing in renewable energy. And the interesting thing that I think is going to happen, Texas aside, because they have so much wind, they're going to end up being renewable whether they want to or not. But the states that have the more what I would call positive environment toward this, like California and New York, are actually going to become more competitive economically because they'll have organizations that are more efficient and effective. And so the politics, I mean, I agree with what you're saying on the politics, mainly because of our need for public investment. The other thing I was going to mention, you were talking about sustainability officers in the private sector. Well, one of the things that Joe Biden did, and this is a big difference between what he did and what Trump did, is he created in the White House a chief sustainability officer who has to deal with the chief sustainability officers in every federal agency. Every federal agency is required to have one, and their focus is actually on procurement. And so the federal government spends a lot of money buying stuff. And we saw some of the politics with the post office, where eventually the post office said, okay, we'll buy electric trucks after all. But it took a little political pushing. I mean, I guess the point is that I think the future belongs to the sustainability principles, and the politics that's trying to pull people away from it are basically anti-modernization as well. And I think that that's going to hurt them in the long run. But I don't minimize the political points you're making. And I also agree that registering people in the swing states is important.
Tracy, you want to jump in? Any thought? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Wolf.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Tracy, go ahead.
I was just going to say that another sort of thing and I think it probably ties into one of the questions about like reliability of various kind of measurement and ratings, because I come from also a social impact and finance kind of view of things, where I know it's very difficult to measure outcomes. And I think, for a lot, it's not just as easy as putting together a spreadsheet. And it's funny, I teach one of the classes on impact investing, and that's one of the first things that the students ask for is, can't they just have an Excel spreadsheet where they can just plug it all in? And unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And especially for those in the medical field, I mean, in many cases, randomized control trials are necessary to really understand the actual impact. And I don't think a lot of companies are going to that expense or that trouble to do that. So I think that it also leaves this question of, how, valid are the measures that we're taking right now to do measurement, to understand what the impact is. I know we talked about scope 3, but I think a point that was made in one of our earlier conversations about, multiple companies, capturing scope 3, does that really make sense? It's incredibly inefficient. We need to think of new ways of approaching this kind of iterative development and impact measurement, so that it is, I would say, more valid to the extent that it can be, or at least more transparent, so that we can all be part of the conversation and the collaboration of, how do we sort of move together and move this forward, knowing that there are a lot of unknowns right now.
Yeah, I just want to note one thing to Stephen's point. Companies that are committed to this area are not actually backing off. We have conversations with hundreds of them, and whether it's on diversity, equity, inclusion, and so forth, they're required by law to look at things and phrase things a little differently. But we've done countless surveys and have not found anyone who's actually significantly backing off. If it's ingrained in your business and you see the business value of it, you're going ahead. You may not be sticking your neck up in the same way that you have in the past to get it cut off by some governor, but that's companies aren't turning tail on this, I think. The other thing, though, it's a very fundamental thing I wanted to talk about if it's okay, when we get to ethics. Like, what is the ethical obligation when you're talking about your employees, your customers, your communities, and so forth? I mean, there is a fundamental question, and we addressed it in one of our reports that we put out on, I think, on the role of the board in the era of ESG and stakeholder capitalism. Like, is your obligation here to serve their long-term welfare? Is your ethical obligation here to meet their expectations? Or is your ethical obligation here to sort of maintain a good relationship with them? Those are three different things. And in some, in some cases, it'll be all three, right? But I think there's, even at a very basic level, sometimes people have said, oh, our obligation as a company, we're gonna have good relations with our employees. And we got to sort of meet their expectations because, if we don't, they're going to quit. But there wasn't a sense that we're actually here to serve their long-term welfare. So I just want to put that out there, that even when we're talking at a very basic level about stakeholder capitalism, by the way, which is different from ESG. ESG is the what, stakeholder capitalism and the whom. Sustainability combines both the what of environmental and social responsibility and the serving of stakeholders. So just sort of definitionally, that's how I put them together. But there's a very basic question when we're talking about our ethical obligations. What are we even trying to do here? And those are the sort of questions that, frankly, a lot of companies don't even have. I mean, just toss out a couple other things for you to think about. We've recently been talking with with member companies about, what they're doing to foster and protect democracy. They don't even have a definition of democracy because it's more than just majority rule. It's also free and fair elections. It's protection of minority rights. It's a culture that supports a democracy. What are they doing for diversity? Well, diversity is also not so simply defined. So I think one of the challenges in this whole area, whether it's governance or sustainability or ESG or democracy or diversity, is we toss around these terms and we don't spend enough time talking about what we actually mean by them and then what we're trying to achieve. So I know that sort of broadened this out a little bit, but I do think that one of the things that could be really good for all of the students or others who are watching this is, please take some classes in philosophy. Please take some classes in logical and analytical reasoning, because this requires people who are going to actually push on these things and try to get to deeper meaning than just sort of saying, oh, groupthink, I think we all agree on this, let's just move on.
Well, thank you for bringing that up, because I wanted to come back to ethics. So, and also, how do you define justice? Yes, we're fair. We help the wealthy people. We're fair, or whatever. People who give us more money, we have more responsibility to them. So I think thinking these things through is important. So let me come back. Any thoughts on that? No, I would just add to the list is just to come back. We touched on earlier is I still, how companies make decisions about short-term benefit versus long-term gain. I mean, it's one thing to say, we'll have a technological fix. That would be great. Sometimes there may not be a technological fix in the near future, perhaps, the far future. And so in the meantime, we have short-term benefit, we're going to make more money, polluting the atmosphere by whatever we're doing versus long-term gain. I mean, how do you see those ethical decisions being made in with outcomes that are not optimal, for instance, ethically?
Every day.
Well, of course, because I think most companies, when making their pollution control expenditures, say we're going to follow the regulations. That's what they do, and the regulations are insufficient. We know that the regulations that we have on the books have allowed dangerous levels of greenhouse gases to get into the atmosphere. I think it's very hard to convince most companies to spend a huge amount of money on pollution controls that are not required by law. And I'd be interested if others here disagree with me, but that's certainly been my observation as a lawyer representing a lot of companies for a long time.
Well, I think part of it is if a company has an existing facility that's been designed with pollution as one of the outcomes of then it's hard. On the other hand, if it's a new factory and you can actually, using the concepts of industrial ecology to build something that doesn't pollute to begin with, they often find that those factories make more money because they don't waste as much, and they're built with newer technology. So I think that it's true that if somebody has a lot of capital invested in a polluting factory, they're going to keep pumping it out until they amortize it and get every nickel out of it, and that's where you need regulation. But I think the other side of it is that there's a lot of thinking going into how do we engineer this production process so that we don't run into that problem. And like I said, I mean, I think to me, agriculture and Land O'Lakes is a great example of that, because they make a lot more money when they don't waste water and pesticides and herbicides and fertilizer and really target it to the plant. And we have the technology to do that. But if you have an old tractor and you can't get the new stuff, you have a problem. Interestingly, some of the companies making the tractors are now lowering the price so that farmers can get into this new technology. So I do think that you've got some different kinds of business problems that result in different behaviors. But I think in general, you've got to have a regulatory framework no matter what, because you're not really, it's the Norfolk Southerns that you got to worry about, because they can poison you in a nanosecond. So you got to be careful. That's why you need a regulatory structure. But in terms of a good business principle, I think that organizations that build polluting technologies are on the wrong side of the future. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, Bob, it's a spectrum, right? I mean, I think companies, there's a range of what they do, and part of this is the sophistication with which they approach the return on investment. I'll just give you an example. I worked at Time Warner for a bunch of years, and we were actually really pretty good at looking at the return on investment of a particular merger, or if we were buying back our stock or something like that. We weren't all that really good at looking at the return on investment of our existing businesses, to Stephen's point, right? And so, if we're building a new something, we were pretty good at it. So part of this is just the maturity of a company's own processes for analyzing its ROI. And if it's doing it intelligently, it will be looking at those out years, right? So part of this is just the sophistication of their own internal management and what they take into account. So when you're talking about the return on investment, you're not only looking at the cost savings or additional revenue, you should also look at the ability to attract and retain talent, right? There are other benefits that are measurable, right? There's reduced reputational risk. There's the license to operate. There are a lot of other returns that come from operating in a sustainable manner that companies aren't necessarily all that sophisticated at capturing these days. So I think that you've got a lot of companies that are trying to do the right thing. They do tend to be on a spectrum, but I think part of this is just they don't actually have the tools or the information necessarily making its way into the C-suite, making its way into the boardrooms to make those truly informed decisions. They're not out there in a sociopathic way to do harm to the planet. They actually understand that they don't want to, but part of it is getting the information in there reliably so that they can make those judgments, and there will be some trade-offs, but how can they make it intelligently? It's a big challenge. That's why one of the things we're focusing on this year in the ESG Center is a series of roundtables on the ROI of sustainability, because trillions are invested in this area. There's skepticism from all sides on this. And so how can you actually, in a practitioner way, really look at the true ROI of sustainability? It's going to be one of our signature projects this year.
So just to come back on the ethics again, so obviously there's some ethical questions where there are, or challenges where there are regulations that address or attempt to address them. But I can imagine there are ethical tensions that come up where there aren't regulations. So for instance, a company may have a factory somewhere and it's not earning as much money, or it's pollute, or or whatever. And so should we close? If we close it, though, there'll be a lot of unemployed people. It may damage the town's economy. The town may, become desperate, whatever. I mean, how do those are there just tensions like that come up where it's, the welfare of people in a poor country that maybe gets factored in the decision, maybe shouldn't get factored in the decision, should be factored more? Do those kinds of questions come up? Are they dealt with adequately? That may be a little from left field. I thought I'd throw that out.
Left field. It's really hard, because when you look at, for example, M&A. Okay, so we recently put out a piece on the intersection of M&A and ESG. Right, that's a pretty straightforward issue. So you're buying something, you're divesting something. So only about 5 to 9% of the deals in the world right now are being driven by, that's a sustainable company, let's go buy it, or this is a toxic thing we don't want to have anymore, let's divest it, right? The real question is, what are the factors you consider when deciding whether to buy or sell? And do you look at the impact on local communities, right? Do you look at all that sort of stuff? And the fact is that those issues are not actually being deeply addressed, right? Or even if they're picked up in the due diligence process, it doesn't necessarily make its way to the ultimate decision makers. They just don't. I mean, you're still looking at M&A largely through compliant, like, am I buying a company that's got a bad track record in bribing people or something like that? It's not as deeply embedded, as it could be in those very discrete decisions that where it could be. So, I think we're at the early stages of thinking those things through. Do you buy a factory? Do you shut it down? All that kind of thing. It's just not part of the consideration set for a lot of transactions. Having said that, I was very glad that we did some things when I was at Time Warner where we made the ethical decision and the right business decision. They went hand in hand. We did not sell the company to Rupert Murdoch. It was in the best interest of our shareholders not to sell to Rupert Murdoch. It was also in the best interest of our country.
So let me come back to, let me just other questions on the answers to the ethics issue.
I just want to say the U.S. regulatory and legal structure is not well suited to considering the effects we're having on other countries. A basic purpose of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act is to bring more manufacturing here, and we don't care whether factories in other countries shut down. The methods that we have accounting for greenhouse gas emissions don't care if we export the emissions burden, that if the cement and iron and steel are made in India and China and cause huge greenhouse gas emissions, that doesn't count for our own accounting. The U.S. Contributes a measly amount of money to foreign assistance on climate change. We're just not set up, the legal structure and the political structure, it's primarily the political structure, are not set up to care about welfare abroad.
Yeah, Europe is a little different, at least in terms of disclosures, because I think one of the things that's going to come out of the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is people are going to be talking about their global ESG impacts, negative and positive, up and down the value chain, and that's going to bring a lot of stuff to light. And so I entirely agree with you, Michael. I think we'll see what happens in the wake of European-driven disclosures, whether some of this shifts.
So we have just a few minutes left. So in my mind, one question just come back to, I'll just throw these out, is the role of AI in all this. One is to come back to, should corporations have a role in promoting democracy or preventing its demise? And then there was a question early on in the chat about the effects of war. There's a few wars going on at the moment around the world in various places. And does that enter into all this or affect all this? So I'll just throw those out and see if anyone wants to have any comments on AI, democracy, or war. Little topics, I know.
As Mike knows, the head of New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation actually spent a lot of time in Ukraine trying to help people, but at the same time was documenting the environmental damage. So Mike may know more about that than I do, but I have to say that he certainly saw this very directly.
Yeah, I think really fast, war. Every company that cares about ESG needs to care about international stability and security, right? And so every company that, so call your congressman about Ukraine, right? I mean, that's just, the world order is at stake here, and that's important. So I think the other thing is companies are in the front lines of international security in a way they don't think they are. Whether we face war in cyber, we face war in privacy and theft of intellectual property, U.S. corporations are on the front lines of global conflict. So if you care about ESG, you got to care about that. Democracy, it is one of the top, I think, 5 concerns for U.S. CEOs is the state of democracy, but companies are not particularly comfortable addressing the topic because democracy has been partisanized, right? And so one of the few things that they do feel comfortable doing is helping their own employees register to vote, that sort of thing, giving people time off. So there are neutral ways to address this that don't get you embroiled in culture wars. And there are ways of addressing it through civic education. But I would say democracy, that's a long-term trend that, you know, it's going to require a greater investment. AI is going to be one of the great ethical challenges of our day. It's going to challenge every company to handle this technology responsibly. And the better governed companies that are more attuned to those stakeholder trade-offs that you talked about, Bob, in the short and long term, are going to be much better able to make decisions in this area than those who don't have that sort of ethical compass. But you know, it is going to be a sort of overwhelming in some ways challenge when 50% of the corporate executives around the world, around the US, say that only 50% say their board has a good understanding of the impact of technology on their business model. There's a lot of work to be done in corporate boardrooms by management. This is really a failing on management's part to make sure that the board understands the impact of technology and is able to address the impact of AI. Huge, huge issues. So that's a quick rundown on your three.
Speaking of macro issues, I think one area where there's a big disconnect between what's needed and what is happening by many corporations is understanding what the future of the climate itself will be. You go down to Miami and you see construction cranes putting up big buildings that are going to be uninhabitable some years from now. But I'm still astonished by that. But the insurance policies are just for a couple of years, and the builders build it and they get out and so forth. But a lot of the most recent projections about what's happening with global temperatures and climate and extreme weather events show that many of the decisions that companies are making today are not at all reflective of the climate that is coming at us. I think the food sector, the agricultural sector is especially vulnerable to that, but infrastructure and logistics and construction, many of these things, I think most companies have not truly woken up to the climate that is coming in the next within the lifetime of the investments they're making, and a lot sooner than that.
Tracy, was a question in the chat for you, by the way. I saw you were typing to it.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we would have time.
Yeah, you want to address it?
Sure.
Just
the question was whether or not I saw investors being scared off as a result of ESG in early stage companies. And I think it depends. I've never seen an investor scared off because of it. I think it's just really difficult for investors to sort of figure out how to place a value on it at the early stage, especially when you don't have, if you're a company that doesn't have product market fit, yet there's a whole bunch of other risks that are sort of top of mind for investors before they get to sustainability. I think that happens at later stages as companies grow and scale, and their governance structure also grows. Then you start to get more of those kinds of questions. However, and I think impact investors focus in on this kind of stuff in particular. So I think they might be more receptive to it. So I've seen actually the opposite. They want to see things like ESG considerations in companies from the very beginning days. But yeah, I think, and the other thing is, but with, something like AI, I'm just now working on a diligence assessment for VCs on responsible AI. And I would say, there are many companies that are being funded right now that are doing all kinds of things, probably, in terms of, not protecting the data or maybe not owning the data. There's all kinds of stuff that's getting funded that I think down the line, when regulation eventually is in place, we'll have a rude awakening, and that will create a new set of risks for investors to really start considering. But right now, it's just not the case.
Yeah, almost everything. If you look at the European regulation, there's sort of red zone, you can't do, green is very little. Almost everything anyone wants to do in AI is high risk. It's all yellow. It's all in that middle, and you need, and it could be like what people did with consumer data, where you're just going to wake up and say, "Uh-oh, that entire business, proposition just falls apart because it's contrary to regulation."
Well, and I also think, somebody pointed out to me that I think it's a good reminder is that, there's also a creative side to this, which is writing and music and, other things that AIs can be used for. And, do you really then need to understand, reliability and prediction capabilities and making sure that it's, producing, so there's lots of different ways it can be used. And I think we're just at the sort of beginning of that, of understanding what the impact is.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been a fascinating discussion, and we can go on for a long time, I know, but I just want to thank Stephen and Paul and Tracy and Michael for amazing insights and thoughts on these complex areas. I mean, part of just showing us the breadth and the complexity and needs for action and glimpsing some of the new world that we're entering, all of us. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. As attendees, we'll be posting this on YouTube and sending you a link. We have some wonderful upcoming events also, Ethics for Lunch with issues of adolescents preserving sperm and eggs in the future if they're having cancer. Should hospitals pay the ransom if there are cyber attacks, psilocybin versus the DEA? We'll be sending information about this as well. And again, most of all, thank you to our wonderful guests. Terrific, really brilliant thoughts. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good night. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.